Imanada mugomina we farali juguluka sisa moya.
Hello everyone, we are excited to welcome you to the second Baobab webinar discussion on race and racism. To start us off, I would like to invite Kodu Diao from the Mastercard Foundation to provide the opening remarks and to introduce our guest for today. Kodu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mokhtar. My name is Kodu Diao. I am the Scholars Program lead for Eastern African Partner Network based in Nairobi. I am filling in for my colleague Ashley Collier, who could not join us today, but she sends her regards. And Ashley oversees all the work that we do with the Baobab platform and Baobab Summit. And I am excited to be here. This is another opportunity to engage more on the topic of race and racism, which we know has been plaguing the United States more recently with flare-ups and events related to George Floyd's death and just a number of demonstrations from people who are fed up with this situation. As the Mastercard Foundation, we denounce all forms of racism. In the first webinar, we were able to hear the stories and experiences of scholars who are studying in North America and Europe and how they have navigated unwelcoming spaces during their studies away from home. As a former student in the United States, I certainly can relate. In responding to requests from scholars, this time, we will hear from an expert on anti-Black racism in Africa. We hope that these conversations will help us at the foundation to better support the youth, and we also hope that they provide useful insights for the future transformative leaders that you are, and that we can together build an anti-racist society wherever we may be located around the world. I would like to introduce our two guests for today's discussion. First is Tanatsei Gambura, who will be moderating the interview. Tanatsei is a Pan-Africanist and womanist. She's concerned with decolonial efforts. She is a geographer, a historian, and a cultural theorist at heart. Her interests include identity, indigeneity, and Black womanhood in the context of post-independence, immigration, and geopolitics. Tana is currently a Mastercard Foundation scholar at the University of Edinburgh, where she's pursuing a bachelor's degree in intermedia art. Next, we have our esteemed expert speaker, Professor George Dei. Professor Dei, Nana Dei, is Ghanaian born and is a renowned educator, a researcher, and a writer who is considered by many as one of Canada's foremost scholars on race and anti-racism studies. Currently, he is a professor of social justice and education and the director, social justice education, and a director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. He has received numerous awards and honors for his work. In 2017, he was elected as Fellow of Royal Society of Canada, the most prestigious award for an academic scholar. Most notably, in June 2007, Prof. Dei was installed as the traditional chief in Ghana, especially as the Gia Sehene of the town of Asokore, Korofurida, in the new Juaben traditional area of Ghana. His tool name is Nana Adosei Sefa Tweneboa. Thank you, Nana, for gracing us with your presence and for taking the time to share your knowledge and your wisdom with the future leaders of Africa. I'm looking forward to what will be a great conversation, I hope, and we'll hand over to Tana. Tana, back to you.
Thank you, Kodu, for the introduction, and welcome again to the audience. My name is Tana, and I'm excited to be moderating the interview with Nana today. Just to set the stage for our event, this is the order of proceedings that we will be having today. First of all, Nana and I will have a conversation for about 40 minutes, discussing a myriad of questions about racism, his work, and Black Lives Matter in an African context. We will then take questions from you, the audience, for about 5 to 8 minutes. Then we will close off with a few announcements of upcoming events. And as we're in conversation, please add your comments in the chat function. If you have questions, please add them to the Q&A function, and you can find both of these functions at the bottom of your screen. Nana will answer a few questions that we will pull from the Q&A towards the end. And lastly, please note that this webinar is being recorded. So with that, Nana, greetings. It's such a privilege to be here in community with you, and I look forward to a brilliant conversation. Before we delve into the main questions, in addition to the introduction Kudu provided, what else do you feel we need to know about you, Nana, and the work you do? And what are you hoping to get from our discussion today?
Yeah, let me begin by recognizing the land. So this is more of a land acknowledgement. And I think it's so important because I think in Africa, whether you talk about it in Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, or Tanzania, right? There's a saying that every space, every classroom, right, is a sport, a land that people have to fight to liberate. So the land acknowledgement is very important. Also, for somebody who is also a traditional chief in Ghana, I think it gives me the time to connect to the ancestors and give us a spiritual strength. I want to thank you, Tana, but also the Baobab Alumni Platform and the MasterCard Foundation for making this opportunity possible for us to have the discussion. I also want to say hello to all the friends and the students, particularly the youth who are joining us in this conversation. My work in this area goes way back in the 1980s, right? But you asked the question about what are some of the lessons that I want people to take from this session. And there are three things I just want to emphasize. One is that the fact that race and racism, and in fact, anti-Black racism, are very much part of our collective psyche. I think we're all talking about it today, but particularly for Black and African people's existence, right? And we can no longer stay silent and not act on what we see around us. And I think to me, how we break our silences, how we respond to the reflection, and also how we address the pushback is very, very important in that. Secondly, I think we need to ask a very important question, and that is, we have to ask ourselves, right? What does the senseless death of George Floyd in May of this year, what does it mean to us as Black and African peoples? How does this movement, right, the time, the space, even wherever we are located, how are we able to engage these conversations around Black Lives Matter in terms of making a difference in our lives and also our communities? And how do we call on our political and cultural narratives? But not only that, but also our spiritual memories in order to have some understanding of what it is that we need to address. And the last thing I also want people to take out from this is that we must pursue a politics of hope and possibilities. I don't want us to boil down on limitations, but hope and possibilities. And I think at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to design our own futures. We don't want people to design our futures for us. We want to design our own futures. And this has with new futurities, and the youth have a responsibility in addressing these new futurities and that. And I believe strongly that everything is possible, that something different is possible, and we must advocate that.
Thank you, Nana. And I think as young people, the audience in mind especially, I think we really sit at the intersection or the crux of what it means to be
right.
At the forefront of a futurist movement, and imagining what a new future can look like, because we have the future ahead of us. So thank you for building on this notion of race as power. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that racism is not only, an individual action, it's societal and systemic. So could you share how you came to understand notions of race and racism? What inspired your scholarship on anti-Black racism and African education specifically?
Yeah, good. Let me start with how I've come to understand the question of race and racism, right? I think we all know that race is a contested concept, right? It's very much contested, and sometimes even it's resisted. We also know that it's a social construct. It's something that we can't actually pinpoint to in terms of whether we want to have a scientific discussion or intellectual discussion. But to respond to your question, I want to go back to some of my readings earlier on. And I think there was a book by a scholar by the name of Joshua Glasgow, when he posed some questions. And I want to respond to that with some of the questions differently, the questions that he was asking. When it comes to race and racism, there's a normative question. And that is a question which is around whether it's valuable or relevant for us to be engaged in that. And my answer is yes, because people use it to sort us into groups and punish us or reward us on the basis of that. So it's very, very important. But it's also important because it's race that makes racism real, possible. So we have to understand it. Then there's also the ontological question, whether it is real, right? Race may not have any meaning in terms of its intellectual validity or scientific validity, but it is real in terms of its ramifications and consequences, and we have to address it. And then there's the conceptual question, which is, for example, how do we conceptualize race and race talk? The everyday conversations of race is going to be different from, say, scholars trying to understand the concept. Sometimes you don't need to say race to mean race. We see it in terms of the dog whistles, or some now people talk the dog barking. You hear it, the racial animals, immigrants, welfare mothers. Right? You don't need to say race to mean that. So we need to understand it in terms of the everyday talk on race and be able to decipher the codes, right? The codes that are very, very important. And then there is the methodological question, how do we study it? And this is where the objective and the subjective come into play. Because in terms of the objective, you could say you can have a very objective and rational conversations about race. But that's not enough, because race is about our feelings, it's about emotions, about how we express ourselves. And I think it's very, very important to talk about the subjective knowing, because when you focus too much on the objective, you can then argue that, oh, you can ask people, are you racist or not? And if they say no, then it means they are not racist. No, right? You have to understand how people who have received racism, people who have been at the forefront of racial oppression, try to make sense of that knowledge. And that is so important. That is so important in the discussion. I think it's also very, very important for us to be able to deal with this issue also in terms of how we connect to the politics that we play. And that means for us to work with some understanding that race is consequential. Race is very, very consequential. The idea that I don't see color is an insult. Right? Color is not a problem. And maybe we'll talk about this, people like Christian Slater. Color is not the problem. It's the interpretation that we put on the color that is the problem. And then our differences are not negatives. They are not a drawback. They don't hinder us. In fact, our differences should be seen as signs of strength, right? But at the end of the day, we have to talk about race as about power and privilege. And that's how we come to understand the whole conception of racism. You asked a question about what has inspired my scholarship in this. And here I want to share some personal stories in that, right? As I said, I came into discussion in the 1980s, right? But I remember very well as a graduate student at McMaster, right? When I came to Canada in 1979. Anytime race issues came up, I would say, well, for me, when I finish school, I'm going back to Ghana. So you guys can stay here and deal with your problem. Boy, was I so wrong, right? You can't escape anywhere when we talk about race. And I think it's so important, right? But over the years, certain things have happened. I mean, as a student, right? I remember in the early 1988, the Black community in Toronto were protesting very vehemently about the police killing a Black man by the name Lester Donaldson. And I remember community activists like the late Dudley Laws and also Charles Roach speaking so powerfully about why we need to address the problem of racism. And I began to pick up the lessons from it. And that as Africans, we cannot be silent. This is not about somebody, it's about us. But also I remember, apart from this, I remember as a student at the University of Toronto, right, sitting in demonstrations about protesting the University of Toronto having investments in South Africa and asking for divestment. So all these things have shaped my ideas. But also in terms of the work, my early work was on development studies. And in terms of development studies, I began to really think about why people even want to do this work. Look, they go somewhere to try and save imperial savior. We're going to save somebody. When even in their own communities, they haven't saved people in their own communities. So development is not doing something somewhere. It's about doing something within our own neighborhoods. And most of the people who do this work, they don't talk about their own privilege, right? So race, to me, racial privilege of development workers was very, very important, right? But there's so many examples, right? I can also share some stories about, as a student at the University of Toronto, where there was a notice board, there was a sign on the notice board asking international students, because I came as an international student in 1979, asking us to enroll in speech language classes, which were guaranteed to change our accents. And we had to pay $20 for that. I'm so glad I didn't pay, right? Maybe I didn't have the money, but I'm so glad I didn't. Language and accent is part of our identity, and we must be proud of it, right? We must be proud of it in that sense. But also, I think to me, it's very, very important to look at this also in terms of how, as a student, international student trying to renew my visa, right? I remember very well, during those days, you have to go very early in the morning, queue to get to see the immigration officer. You'll be standing in front of the immigration officer, but he will speak to you so loudly as if you can't hear what he's saying. And all this made me think that what's going on here. Also, as a member of the Organization of Parents of Black Children, where I went into meetings of this organization, and they kept talking about the school system and what it's doing to their kids, the parents, the mothers, right? So all these things connected to me that the question of race and schooling was very, very important, that we need to take very, very seriously, right? In terms of how my experiences living abroad has shaped the way I see things, even in terms of the connection to Africa, I think it's very, very important for us to see that they should cut across. Africa is here, Africa is not just there, it's here and there, right? So I saw a comparative lens as very, very important in how we understand these issues, because there's a globalization of racism, right? I saw the vestiges of colonial education, where, for example, growing up in Ghana, you know more about the waterfalls in Canada and Europe than the rivers in your own village, where your mother would cut the fish and cook for you. And that was a problem, right? I also remember, right, that when we look at our school system, right, the post-colonial African educational system, the emphasis is on national integration. And through that process, we sweep differences under the carpet. So we want all to be Ghanaians, we want all to be Nigerians, we want all to be South Africans. And we don't talk about our differences, the differences of class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, ability. These are very important. They cannot be swept under the carpet. So there's a connection, right? Europe is not the advent of human history. The world did not begin with Europe. And this is why we need to talk about Africa's contribution, Africa as a legitimate source of knowledge and knowing, and that when there's silencing around these issues, we need to speak out because they all connect, right? It's also very, very important that going back home, how the whole question of whiteness played out for me, right? People will want you to bring something from Canada, even when you have it in Ghana, right? This the seduction of whiteness, and this is very, very important. I think the problem with our continent is that we cannot theorize Africa simply as something within the fiscal space. We need to theorize Africa beyond its fiscal boundaries. There's Africa here and there. And that means then that we have to talk about the whole question of what it means to validate our own experts. I think the problem of Africa is not the lack of experts. We don't value our own experts. We want to listen to somebody who is from somewhere and not listen to our own. And that is the problem that we need to address in that context.
Thank you, Nana. I really connected with your anecdote there about approaching the University of Toronto and this language class being imposed on you. And it just speaks so true to how institutions shamelessly normalize the ideas of Western cultural superiority and in fact impose ideas of sameness and homogeneity and assimilation, especially on indigenous people who are then made to be the other. Right. So I really like what you spoke to there about it being a construct, that ideas of race are not factually founded but are in fact constructed, and these constructs do have real ramifications and consequences on the lived experience of Black people all over the world. So if you could speak to race as a construct, right? Could you speak a little bit about your understanding of Blackness and also white privilege, which is kind of this huge, powerful reality that Black people, people of color all over the world are faced with?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things that, for example, we need to understand in terms of the construction of race and how we begin to talk about structural racism, because there's a denial now in the globe around structural racism, right? And I think for me, the incident in New York was very, very powerful to me, where somebody thinks they have the guts to say, look, I'm going to call the New York police and tell them I'm being threatened by a Black man. She didn't mention the name of any police officer. She said she would call the police and tell them if an African male is threatening her. That is so powerful. I mean, I think to me, what it does say is that we have a system in place, right, which is used in many ways to exploit Black pain and Black suffering, and also to create the comfort for some people. And I think this is so important for us to understand. I think when we talk about racism, we have to move beyond the intentions and the prejudices to how it is structural, it is systemic, it's very, very endemic in the institutions that we are part of, right? So we have to look at it more in terms of what are the rules and regulations that guide the institutions that we are part of, and how those rules and regulations shape the way we live our lives and experience our daily lives and experiences. I think we need to go beyond the individual conception. Secondly, we also need to look at the questions of history and context. We cannot talk about racism without looking at colonization and enslavement, right? The belief systems that shaped European colonization of our continent, right? And the enslavement of our peoples, bringing them through the Middle Passage to here. Those belief systems, right, powerfully continue to regulate the way we deal with contemporary institutions and contemporary societies. Also, I think we need to look at it in terms of when we want to talk about these issues, right? We need to look at it as they are embedded in certain ideas that we have, right? So when we say our society is fair, our society is just, right? There's nothing is further from the truth, right? Nothing is further from the truth when we say our society is fair and just, because we have to look at how these notions about fair and just are actually hypocritical. They are very, very hypocritical in that sense. And I think the notion that, for example, you can get to where you are through excellence. We need to trouble what we mean when we talk about excellence. We have narrow definitions of excellence. If you know excellence, it looks like you. If somebody doesn't speak like you, they are not excellent, right? So we need to question those things and how those codes and values actually shape the way we think and that. But also we need to look at the culture of our institutions. What our institutions do is what I call there's a culture of denialism, right? We deny, even when there's injustice, we deny it because we want things to work for us. So that culture of denialism needs to be troubled in that. But also, I think when we talk about racism and how it is structuralized, right? We need to look at it in terms of representation, right? What ideas, what bodies are represented, how they are represented, who occupy the top echelons of our institutions, right? Whether it's Black men, Black female, and the absences in the indigenous bodies, the negations and the omissions. And then what we validate, right? What we validate, right? Sometimes we don't even see how the knowledge system, how it's so powerful, right? I always give this example to my students, right? You can, for example, when you come to our continent, we see a situation where we have a waterfall in Zimbabwe or Zambia, we call it Victoria Falls. And then we ask, why did it name Victoria? And they will say, oh, well, the person who discovered it. Well, what about the people who showed that white man where the falls was, right? Why don't we name it after the local people, right? This is something we have to deal with. And in South Africa, we have this struggle that goes on where monuments should be named after Cecil Rhodes, right? Somebody who's a colonizer who killed and exploited Black people in our experiences. And I'm glad that I think there has been this protest to remove all these names we need more to be done, more work to be done around those issues. You asked a question about white privilege, because I think it's very, very important, and I need to address it because it does speak to us. There's a whole denial around white privilege, right? What happens is that people think when we talk about white privilege, it means that whites don't have hardships. Of course, whites face hardships, but it's not because of their race. They can face it along class, gender, sexuality, ability, but their race becomes a factor that mitigates against that hardships. For us as Black and African peoples, our race is a punishment, right? So race is used in a way that is advantage for whites, but for us, it's a disadvantage. And that's why we talk about it in that sense. I think to me, the whole notion of white privilege has to speak to the question of how history has given some people a head start, right? There's a false sense of entitlement. In fact, one of my former students, Joha, talks about white privilege and whiteness is a pigmented passport, right? It opens many doors. Certain doors are open for white bodies that are open for Black bodies, and we need to deal with that. Our skin color becomes a barrier for us as African and Black peoples. And I think we need to acknowledge that. We also need to see how white privilege means for some people their potential is never in doubt, right? They're expected to do great things. While for some of us, we have to do it 3 or 4 times better not to be validated and that. We also have to see how our humanity sometimes is questioned. Our humanity is questioned, right? For some, their humanity is not questioned. In fact, the world has to adjust to them. They don't have to adjust to the world, right? And that's something that we have to deal with. And one thing about white privilege is also that you have the luxury to choose not to do anything. You can sit on it, right? You don't need to fight, you don't need to struggle, and that because everything will come, right? And I think that's something that we need to. And so these things are very important to understand anti-Black racism. Because when we talk about anti-Black racism, it's also institutionalized. It's not just simply to say, oh, people hate Black people. It's not just that. It's more than that. It's systemic, it's institutionalized, because it works with racial hierarchies. There's a hierarchy of races, and Black and African people should be at the bottom. That's the whole issue about anti-Black racism. We are at the bottom. Our humanity is denied. We are devalued, right? We are seen as disposables, right? We are seen as disposables, and we are criminalized. And this is what anti-Black racism is speaking about, right? It's speaking about the importance of seeing that anti-Black life is always in peril. It's always devalued, it's always wasted, it's always seen as disposable, and we need to fight it, right? And also to recognize that when we deal with anti-Black racism, it's not just about the police force, right? We have to look at it throughout our institutions, whether it's in the schools, in the media, in arts, right? In other aspects, the judicial system. We have to look at it and I think that to me brings us to how then we understand the concept of Blackness. Because if you're going to fight that, we have to understand what it means to be Black, right? And to me, Blackness and Africanness converge. They are not the same thing, but they converge. And to me, understanding of Blackness is to recognize that it's heterogeneous, it's complex, it can be contested, right? But there's a convergences. It's also, Blackness is also demarcated by questions of class, gender, sexuality, right? That to me, when we talk about Blackness, we also have to look at Blackness in terms of the geospaces. And by geospaces, I'm talking about where, for example, we talk about Blackness in Africa, Blackness in Latin America, Blackness in the Caribbean, Blackness in Asia, Blackness in Europe, and look at the complexities of how we come to understand Blackness in that. And I think the connection with Blackness and Africanness is that Blackness has become a political term, right? It signifies questions of resistance and location, whereas Africanness is about an identity which is located in our sense of being as African people. And as I said, there are connections and divergences, but also synergies that we need to draw on. And I think at the end of the day, the critical question that we should be addressing is, what does it mean to be an African or to be a Black body today? And that answer is that it's about resistance. It's about knowing our history. It's about knowing how we deal with the way forward.
Thank you, Nana. And focusing our lens onto the African continent, it's not always obvious to some what our relationship with race is, right? And so when ideas about colonialism as a process or a series of events are coming up in opposition to coloniality as a logic that lives on in the absence of the colonizer, it becomes clearer where racist or Western or colonial logics of othering and violence are, right? And there are major conversations happening right now about police brutality on the African continent, particularly in Zimbabwe right now, or xenophobic sentiments amongst Africans, particularly in South Africa. So how do Africans and the African continent as a whole fit into conversations about anti-Black racism? What do you say to someone who is viewing the continent right now, wondering if anti-Black racism really exists in Black majority Africa, and what might this look like in such a context?
Yeah, look, anti-Black racism exists everywhere. It's global, and Africa is not a physical space. We don't have something like a bracket or a fence that surrounds Africa. Africa is everywhere. So that's how we have to understand it, right? When Black life or Black humanity is devalued anywhere, it must implicate us, it must affect us. That's how we have to understand it. I think the fact that anti-Black racism is globalized, whether it's in Europe, Asia, North America, is very, very important. We are racially profiled everywhere. And I think on the continent, we have to be concerned about that. Don't let us forget that, for example, when we talk about African Muslims, right, have been subjected to xenophobic attacks globally, right? And this is something that for us to deal with, right? I think when we look at Black racism, it works with the tropes of whiteness. It works with the tropes of whiteness. And white racism and the global seduction of whiteness is something that Africa is a perfect example, right? The globalization of whiteness, Africa is a perfect example of that. We are confronted with Blackness also in transnational mobility. Wherever we go, even if we are Africans, wherever we go, we are confronted with this notion of the global Blackness. So the color descriptor is one thing, but how the color descriptor is read across spaces is very, very important. I think on the continent itself, ethnicism, right? Ethnicism is one entry point to understand anti-Black racism. The fact that, for example, certain ethnic groups may think they are privileged than the other ethnic group. That is a form of racism. It's worse ethnicity. But let us also understand that anti-Black racism, right, cannot be understood simply along racial lines. We have to see how it intersects with gender, class, ability, disability. Patriarchy is an issue on the continent. And we cannot understand patriarchy without also understanding the tropes that anti-Black racism works with in that context, right? So I think the question of bringing an intersectional gaze to our understanding of anti-Black racism is very, very important in that sense. And this is where later on we talk about Black Lives Matter, how Black Lives Matter and anti-Black racism connect, right? Because it's about the denial, the dehumanization of the African sense of self and humanity, and that extends across borders and boundaries. When you ask me, for example, the question about, look, when we look at even the majority, the so-called majority Black African countries, right, there is anti-Black racism that we need to address, right, in the majority Black African context, right? The racial hierarchies that I spoke about. Also remember that even the majority Black African context, there are whites who live in those societies. South Africa is a good example, right? So anti-Black racism is relevant. But even when we talk about Ghana, Nigeria, we have Asians, we have Chinese, we have Europeans who are in these places, right? And there's a privileging of that whiteness. There's a privileging of whiteness that we have to deal with. So we have to ask these questions where we are. And it's beyond the question of skin color. It's beyond the question of skin color. We have to look at the processes of racialization and how they work with the tropes of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, language, and class in that sense. And this is where we have to understand it. There is also Black anti-Blackness, right? There's Black anti-Blackness that we have to talk about. I think when I talk about the Black anti-Blackness, right, we have to look at it sometimes even in terms of anti-African racism, right? That some Black bodies would try to exhibit in that sense. And I think the Black anti-Blackness works with the tropes which have to do with the preference for white and whiteness, right? Preference for white and whiteness. And I think we need to reiterate the point that I made earlier on about ethnicism as also being relevant, even in the so-called dominant Black communities, right? And how this is very, very relevant. At the end of the day, if we take anti-Black racism as, which is something about power, systemic power, right? Then we have to see how our institutions, right? Our institutions. Let's look at the institutions on the continent, right? What are the values that these institutions work with? Do they work with the African indigenous knowledge systems, or do they work with European values and ideas, right? Some of us have made the point, right? And I've made the point, not only me, I know Malefisanti and others made the point. We do have universities in Africa, but we don't have African universities. There's a distinction. It's one thing to have universities in Africa, but it's another to say we have an African university. The universities in Africa are colonial satellites of the Western academy. And I think we need to speak about that, right? Because everything that we do, right, borrows on the frames of reference of these communities in that context.
And I really like what you mentioned there, Nana, about, you know, the whole idea about race and racism, even on the African continent, being about questioning the very humanity of African people. And that is why the work of anti-racist groups and individuals such as yourself is so courageous and vital. And so I want to ask you about the challenges you've encountered in your work, but before I do that, I want us to focus on the current climate and the Black Lives Matter movement that has amplified the voices of Black people in North America and around the world in relation to police brutality and overall experiences of anti-Black racism. How does the Black Lives Matter movement impact or influence your own work, and why should African people be concerned with it?
Yeah, good questions, right? I think when we have to understand the history of the Black Lives Matter, the haystack, right? And the three Black queer women who are at the forefront, Alicia, Opal, and Patrice, right? It's become a rallying point, not just for racial justice and police brutality, but also to link with questions of economic justice, environmental justice, questions about the land, right? Water, right? So that those things are things that Africa should be concerned, right? Economic justice. When we talk, for example, about Black Lives Matter, it's about police brutality and more, right? The people who have been killed, whether we talk about George Floyd, right? We talk about in terms of Andrew Loku, who is an African, or Jimmy Kaba or Freddie Gray, Sandra Grant. We can mention the names in the US, but we do have an African martyrs, African bodies who have been killed, right? And even the fact that even if they were killed as US citizens, they are still Black people and Africans. And I think the rallying cry of Black Lives Matter should be something that we should speak to. I think all these notions about all lives matter, right? Blue lives matter, they are just distractions, right? There's a reason why we say Black Lives Matter, because all lives have not mattered. That's why we say Black Lives Matter. So until we can say Black Lives Matter, I don't want to hear anybody talk about all lives matter, because Black lives have not mattered. So you cannot say all lives matter, right? And I think that's so important. And this is something that the Black Lives Matter is bringing up, right? And it's given us such a role to look at intersectional politics and how it is played out in our communities. You ask why should we be concerned, right? Apart from all the things that we've talked about, why we should be very, very concerned, I think Black Lives Matter is about restoring the African soul and the African dignity to its rightful place. That's what it is. At the end of the day, that's what it is, right? Our lives should worth just as much as white life. You cannot just take a Black life and think it is cheap. It can be disposed of. It can be dispensed with without any cost. Our lives should cost just as much as white lives. And this is no matter whether we are on the continent or not. So Africans on the continent need to be concerned about it, right? We need to be concerned about the global fight for Black lives in that sense. I think also we have to recognize that the struggles, the rallying cry, the protests, and now it has become global, right? That Black Lives Matter functions that are being set up all over the world. We do have that. I think you mentioned the case in Zimbabwe, right? I'm sure in Ghana and Nigeria, right? People are mobilizing around that. We need to support that because they link the struggles, right? It's not just in the US. I'm sure the people in the US who are fighting are our own people. They are brothers and sisters, right? And they are fighting for economic justice, environmental justice, climate justice. They are also fighting for land, and also they are fighting for survival. And I think that's something that we should. But I also want to talk about Black Lives Matter in terms of the continent, right? Because when we let's look at what is happening to our own communities on the continent, right? It's not like people's lives don't matter, right? How are rural people surviving? How do our governments take responsibility to provide survival for our communities, right? It's about Black lives, they matter. So look, let's translate that to our own communities. we have so many resources in Africa, and yet our people go begging, right? And that our lives should matter. African lives should matter in that sense. So I think that is very, very important. I think it's about drawing these connections about the economic capitalist system and what it's doing to our communities, and how our own leaders have not had that responsibility and courage to ensure that the daily bread, the survival of our peoples and our communities are first and foremost, right, on the minds of governance. And I think that's why Black Lives Matter should matter. But Black Lives Matter also in Africa because of the internalized racism, right? Because like I said, right, one of the things about racism is that it can be internalized and we can revisit it on other people. And what we see is that when we talk about, you can have somebody fight anti-Black racism and still engage in anti-African racism, right? And this is why we have to connect these struggles in that context, right? And extend the fight to the Black life, the African life, wherever we find it, and argue that Black lives cannot be cheapened, right? That the economic hardships on the continent need to be addressed. Otherwise, the lives of our people are not mattering, and they must matter to our governments, to our leadership in that context. And that's why I think these things are very, very important in that regard.
And I think most importantly about Black Lives Matter is that it's about speaking truth to
exactly.
power, which is an activist. It's an activist action to do, and that comes with the threat to your very life, and
Yeah.
comes with, you know, you're subjected to all sorts of violences, whether it's institutional or from your government or from individuals, right? And so I'd like to talk about, you know, some challenges that you've encountered in doing this work and how you navigated those challenges. And in speaking to those challenges, how can young people who are involved in resisting or changing racism in their immediate societies, what advice would you give us as young people living on the continent abroad in dealing with these challenges and navigating the difficulties that this activist work comes with?
Yeah. Obviously, there are recent challenges in doing this work, right? I've always argued that, for example, in the academy, right? If you want to go far in the academy and you're a Black scholar, don't say anything about race. Because once you start saying something about race, people always get on that you're always making trouble, you're making, creating trouble. And there's risks on our lives, right? I think the threats, I mean, there's so many things, so many horror stories I can tell you, but I know our time and I can't, but there have been threats on those of us who talk about race. In fact, we've been accused that if the word race didn't exist, we would have invented it in the dictionary, right? There is that, right? I remember one of my students, right, Bomish, a long time ago said, George, he saw me working on my computer and he said, George, take a break, right? Because I don't want in your obituary, and he was making a joke, I don't want in your obituary something to be said that, oh, and the last word he typed on his computer before he died was race and racism, right? He was making that joke, but he was seeing that this gets worse, right? There's a cost, emotional, psychological cost to us, and I think we need to deal with that. Sometimes we have the resistance, the pushback, right? We are seen as anti-intellectual, right? We are seen as always making trouble, right? And that even when we want to resist, right? What we see, our resistance is where that's creating trouble, right? And so this is why some people have been forced to be quiet, right? And they put their own communities under the bus. You can have some Black scholars, some African scholars who put their own communities under the bus because they don't want to speak about the issues, because they know that when they speak about this, consequences, punishment, and they're not prepared to deal with that. So this culture of denialism that I speak about, the silencing of courage, right? They all present threats for us. And there's a pushback, right? There's a pushback. I've had moments when somebody would even write to the school administration saying, Nana is teaching his students to hate white people, right? We have this complaints made, right? And there have been threats on my own life, and I'm not alone in that. I think you can ask many racialized scholars who speak on these issues, right? And that, so there's a pushback. But the question is, how do we navigate, right? I think to me, I find the community, having a community behind you is so important. We learn from the shoulders of those who have gone before us, and they give us the courage to continue to fight, because we learn from them, we stand on their shoulders, working with the communities. Personally, also working with students. My students have been my backbone, right? I learned so much from them, and they give me so much, and they support the work, right? So when you talk about how you navigate that, it's about having the community behind you and then being able to deal with those communities in that sense. But also the question of choosing one's battle, right? There's not everything that you can fight. You have to be very, very selective in the battles that you want to fight, right? And where you think you're going to make a difference and making allies. But remember that at the end of the day, there are critical friends. I talk about critical friends. There are critical friends that we can make. Friends that can support the causes. They can support us and give us the strength, right? I believe strongly that equity work flows from spirituality. You asked a question about for young people, right? I think to me, young people, one of the things that young people have to do is recognize that they need to form these groups, right? I would want them to protest, to form groups like Black Lives Matter in their own communities, whether in the country, whether in Ghana, Nigeria, from that, right? Go on protest, right? Ask questions, right? Remember that the world has changed in part because the youth are being the vanguards, pushing for that change. When I see youth on the street now, right, it gives me hope because I know that the youth of today are no longer prepared to be silent. They're no longer prepared to take the things I might have taken when I was growing up. They are no longer prepared. And I see my own children in that light that they are going to be speaking out and they are all going to be doing that in that sense. So form the local groups, use the social media, use social media very well because social media can be positive and it can be negative. Use it positively, creatively to disseminate information, to bring awareness into people. Ask questions, never be silent, ask questions. But also acknowledge our privileges. Let us acknowledge our privileges. Let's hold people accountable. Let's hold our teachers accountable, our parents, our governments. And I think youth should be able to do that. They should build communities, right? And I think to me, at the end of the day, resistance should be part of the language of every youth. Resistance. And to fight that resistance is rewarded. We must develop the courage to speak out. We must develop that awareness to understand what it means to be African. We must also always exhibit Black brilliance and excellence. I think if you want to do something, make sure you damn well know what you want to do so that nobody can come back and say, you know what, you are just an empty talk. You don't know what you are. So just learn and study, know the history, know your history, and don't be afraid. I talk about design your futures and make this movement a sea movement of change, a movement that we need to talk about change. But remember that I always say that change is not inevitable, you know. Change is not inevitable. We have to fight for change. Change doesn't come by accident. We have to fight for it. Recently, I'm quoted as saying that, look, a lot has happened, but not a lot has changed. There's a difference. A lot has happened, but not a lot has changed. The more things change, the more things remain the same, as we said. And I think youth should be the vanguards of the future and to basically fight wherever they are and just not stand there. I think in conclusion, when you ask that question, right, just the 5 points I want youth to become leaders, right? You can be follower, but become a leader where you initiate ideas, you bring people together, you build communities. Also remember your history, that as a Black, as an African, our history is about resistance. It's about liberation, it's about struggle, right? The only reason why we have survived today is that our forefathers, our elders, our ancestors fought the very fights we are making today, and we must continue that fight. So wherever you find yourself, don't stand there. Do something. Just don't be there. Just do something. And remember that any community is as good as we collectively work to make it. So that means then that if you want a community doesn't exist in space. We build communities, we create them. It doesn't exist in space and you plug it. You work hard at it and you create it. And finally, remember that so far as we can breathe, as Black people, as African people, so far as we can breathe, there must be hope and there must be possibility. And that's a message that I'll give to the youth of today.
Thank you. What an emboldening message. I think unpopular as the work is, young people are beginning to be courageous enough to do it. And especially, like you said, on social media, I think we're finding very creative ways in harnessing the new technologies and new ideas around us to speak truth to power. So thank you so much, Nana, for a rich and informative conversation. I've learned so much from this short time with you. And so I'm just going to move on to take a few questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes, so if we can keep the answers brief so we can get through as many as possible. The very first question I'm going to ask, someone is saying, Nana, you have spoken so well on racism and of course Africanism and what should influence our discussions of our identities and believing in ourselves as African people. How then do we understand and explain African in the diaspora so asking Africans in the diaspora believing in white superiority and thinking that everything white is better. So I suppose the question is really about how do we speak to fellow Africans in the diaspora who buy into or consent to ideas of white supremacy?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big struggles, right? I think we need to do the homework within our own communities, right? As I said earlier on, there's that feeling that where some people think, oh, even when you speak on race, I've had situations where somebody say, oh, you speak on race, and you hear it from even a Black or African who say, we people are always making noise about race, and they'll try to deny race, right? I think the problem with Eurocentricity, right, is that it's sometimes, it makes us even sometimes not recognize when we buy into the dominant narrative without being very, very critical, right? So when you ask what we can do, I think I'm somebody who wants to talk about African indigeneities and what are the knowledge systems within our African indigeneities, right? But I know, for example, when we talk about African indigeneities, some of the harshest critics of African indigeneities come from our own African scholars who tell us, oh, we live in this modern world, why are you not talking about African indigeneity? Well, the world did not begin with Europe. Europe is not the advent of human history, and colonialism is not our only story, as many people have said, right? So let's reclaim our knowledge systems. Our knowledge systems, which is about empowerment, it's about spiritual growth and regeneration, and be able to deal with that. Let's talk about Afrocentric or African-centered ways of knowing and reacting, right? And when you ask me, I think for African peoples, we have to be very careful how we frame our questions. We can't frame our questions with Eurocentric lens, right? So for me, the question, and others talk about it, I think Molifier Santi and others like Karinga talk about it, right? Rather than ask the question, in whose interest has this served? I prefer we situate ourselves as African learners and ask the question, is this in the best interest of African peoples, right? That is a different question because we center us in that. We don't want to be in spaces where like all we did was to bring the chairs into the space for some people to sit on. We brought the chairs into those spaces and we must damn sit on because we carry the chair into those places, right? And it's very, very important we work with the African proverbial saying that if you want to know how heavy a bag of salt is, you ask the person who is carrying it, right? If you want to know how heavy, ask the person who is carrying it. So we must insist on our voices and we cannot be silent. So we cannot take on this dose of white supremacy, right? And not question it, right? And blame ourselves for the problem in that. Of course, and you see it even in development where people say, well, at this day and age, Africans cannot blame colonialism for their problems. Of course, I think it's very important to hold our leaders accountable. But colonialism has not ended. It's still ongoing. They don't have the bodies there. They have the ideas there. The ideas are so powerful, right? And they are shaping policy. They are shaping the way we do things. And we need to trouble that, right? And so when you ask for Africans in the diaspora, let's begin to recognize who we are, that we are Africans. And Africans is not homogeneous. We cannot flatten and cheapen Africa of its complexities. You cannot say, I'm going to Africa. Of course, you're going to Nigeria or Kenya or Zimbabwe, not Africa. Africa is what? A continent of many countries. And we must question when people do that, right? Africa is not a basket case, right? Africa is about resilience, right? There are success cases we can point to, and we have to make these narratives powerful and meaningful to where we are in these diasporic spaces. But of course, we must connect, right? Because there's so much disunity, right? Even in the diaspora where somebody will say, I'm from the Caribbean and I'm different, or I'm from the continent, I'm different, I'm from Latin America. And there's black Latinas, right? There's Black Caribbeans, African Canadians, Africans, Americans, and that. And we must find a way to connect that our issues may not be the same, but they are shared because of the global dispersal of African and Africanness. And we must find out ways to connect and deal with that. So when somebody asks me, right, for me as a scholar, I always make the distinction between being a Black scholar and Black scholarship. They are not the same. You can be a Black scholar, but you may not be doing Black scholarship. Black scholarship to me is working in a way that is productive to make a difference in the lives of our communities. I see a number of Black scholars who are not necessarily doing Black scholarship. In many ways, they're reproducing Eurocentric scholarship. And we need to question that. It's a journey that we have been, right? And we don't make ourselves innocent in all of this. We are part of the process, and we have to bring people along. We have to also unlearn some of the Eurocentric ideas that we have been schooled. There's so much dose of Eurocentricity that we have to get out of our system. And getting that out of our system is that we have to be very critical, ask questions. Decolonization begins by asking questions, questions that sometimes people put under the carpet, right? We have to bring it to the front and ask those questions.
Absolutely, thank you, Nana. And a popular kind of question that's coming up with the audience is the very question about, you know, colonial mimicry and African people or Black people performing racist ideas on each other. And so could you maybe share one or two strategies or solutions to addressing Black on Black racism or tribalism or you know, separating each other based on ethnicity? That seems to be a really popular question.
I think ethnicism, I think it's a problem. I think sometimes I'm very worried when people, the moments when they talk about the Black on Black violence and that sometimes it's used as a way to escape critiques of the system, right? So we call on it and say, oh, you yourself, you can't get your act together in that. But I think we need to be mindful. I think when we have the conversations is very, very important, right? So you're right. I think we need to have that conversation that if you want to build communities, then it's going to be communities of differences, not communities of sameness, but communities of differences, and how our differences connect, right? And deal with that, right? But I want to come back to the question of the colonial mimicry, because I think it's a very huge issue, right? And Fanon, I'm a scholar of Frantz Fanon, right? The anti-colonial theorist, right? Fanon talks about how that mimicry, I mean, and Homi Bhabha, those who know in his book, Location of Culture, right? When Homi Bhabha talks about that colonial mimicry, right? We are not who we are. We are not our authentic selves. We want to be accepted. We want to be validated. We want to be legitimized. So we don't become who we are as African selves, right? And so sometimes we mimic theories, right? And ideas that hardly speak to us, but we want to be legitimized. So we do that. And that can be killing to the self, to the spirit, and to the inner soul, right? So we have to address that. We have to be proud who we are and stop this mimicry, right? In Nyamnos, right? The African scholar Nyamnos talks about, we shouldn't become intellectual imposters in these institutions. We should not be intellectual imposters. We should be who we are. Claim your authentic self. Be proud of who you are, right? It doesn't mean that you don't engage the scholarship. If you want to engage the scholarship from your position, right? Why is that we learn too much about Shakespeare? We don't learn about Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Amata Edu, or Chimamanda Adichie. Why don't we learn about these theorists, right? And these literary scholars? They also have something to say. And it is our responsibility to do that and not engage in this mimicry. Because the mimicry can be damaging. It wounds us, it hurts us. We are not who we are because we want to be validated and accepted in these colonial spaces. And we want to resist that, right? I think one of the things about being a scholar, right, is that you have to be a scholar that is able to read between the lines, right? You don't, see, there's a saying in Ghana where you know your lane, right? But the reason why you must know your lane is that you know your lane in order that you resist people who want to take you from your lane, want to take you away from that lane. That this is your lane, you're going to be there. You have every right to be in that lane, but you damn well also have the right to be able to engage in conversations with people in the other lanes from where you are at. And I think that is so important in that.
There's so much to unpack there, and I would love to go on and continue the conversation all day, but unfortunately that is all we have time for today. Again, I want to thank you, Nana, for taking the time to come and speak to us young people about a very complex and important topic. I'm sure that we've all learned something today. So we will have a list of some of Nana's articles and other resources for you, the audience, to read on after this webinar that might help to understand or to flesh out or give more body to the conversation that we've had today. I will now hand over to my colleague Cecilia to share some announcements and closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tana. A very big thank you to Tana for being an amazing moderator. To Nana, thank you so much. This has been very educative, very informative, and personally, what I'm taking home is claim your authentic self. And from that, I want to tell you that thank you so much for being an amazing resource person this afternoon. So, and a very big thank you to MasterCard Foundation, and of course to the Baobab team. It's so great. The scholars community is so thrilled to have you. And Connect with Me allows you to connect with scholars who share your personal mission. And by connecting with scholars who share your personal missions, you get to work together, share common opportunities to develop Africa. Now, the link has been shared on the Baobab platform. So kindly do sign up, or from here we'll post it again. Kindly do sign up to connect with other scholars. Remember that Baobab is also on Instagram as Scholars Baobab. You can follow us there, all your questions, all the updates. And then on Facebook, you can also join the MasterCard Foundation Scholars community and get connected to other scholars. So right on your screen is Connect with Me from the Baobab ambassadors. So you get to chat directly with other scholars who share your personal missions. You can sign up and then you have all your details there. So again, thank you so much for connecting to today's webinar. We see you again in our next webinar. Have an amazing week. Thank you.
Nejarabi ma pega nyalo nyela